I am Kelsey, 34 years old. 3 weeks ago, during my family's grand Christmas dinner in Savannah, I walked through the front door, carrying a tray of homemade gingerbread cookies, only to discover my chair had been removed from the table. 46 relatives sat there in absolute silence, the air thick with the scent of pine and unearned privilege. My mother, Danielle, didn't even look up as she adjusted a centerpiece. She simply said, "Kelsey, tonight is all about your sister's guests. We do not have room for disappointments ruining the atmosphere." I did not cry. I did not ask why. I simply looked at the tiny, rickety table they had shoved into the hallway, positioned right next to the rack of dripping, wet coats. My place in the family had been officially revoked. Before I tell you how I turned that rickety hallway table into a courtroom, please let me know in the comments. Have you ever been treated like a stranger by your own blood? I'm reading all your stories. Now, let's get back to the night the $1.5 million secret unraveled. I sat on that rickety wooden stool in the hallway, the edge of the seat biting into my thighs. Behind me, the heavy oak doors were closed, just enough to let me know I was an outsider, but open enough so that every word of my sister's bragging could cut through the air like a jagged piece of glass. Olivia was holding court. Her voice, high and piercing, drifted from the dining hall, dripping with a kind of unearned confidence that only $1,500,000 can buy. That was the amount of her new trust fund. $1,500,000 for being the golden child. The hallway smelled of damp wool from the guests' coats, and the faint, bitter scent of the gingerbread cookies still sitting untouched on my lap. I watched the dust motes dance in the dim light, feeling more like a piece of the architecture than a human being. It was the exact atmosphere of my life for the past 4 years, a mixture of cold neglect and the sweet, desperate efforts I made to be noticed. 4 years. That is how much time I deleted from my own life to save my mother's. When Danielle was diagnosed with stage 1 cancer, the family didn't even have to ask. They just looked at me. Olivia was in Boston, building her brand, and Stephen, my father, said marketing careers couldn't be interrupted for domestic chores. So, I stayed. I walked away from a rising career at a top architectural firm to become a full-time nurse, a cook, and a ghost in my own home. I was the one who learnt the exact temperature she liked her tea when the radiation made her throat feel like it was lined with needles. I was the one who held her hair back and cleaned the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. when the world was silent and she was at her weakest. I was the silent investor in their version of a perfect family, footing the emotional bill while they all overdrafted on my compassion. Sitting there, I finally understood the mechanics of my own misery. I had been living in a house without bars. For years, I thought I was staying out of love, but I realized it was a psychological shackle. They had built a prison out of my own loyalty. They didn't need locks or keys when they had my guilt to keep me in line. Every time I thought about leaving, they'd remind me of how useful I was, and I'd mistake that utility for value. My compassion was a luxury they had exploited, until I was spiritually bankrupt. I looked at the shadow of the 46 relatives dancing against the hallway wall. They were celebrating a legacy built on my erasure. Olivia's trust fund wasn't just a reward for her success, it was a payout for my silence. My mother hadn't recovered her health. She had recovered her ability to be cruel. And my father? He wasn't the man who raised me. He was the man who had been watching me drown for 34 years and decided to use the opportunity to check the water temperature. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a balance sheet. And for the first time, I was done being the one in the red. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the weight of the red wax envelope. It felt heavier than any architectural blueprint I'd ever drafted. Inside wasn't just paper. It was the wrecking ball for the prison they thought I'd never leave. I stood up. There was no hesitation, no racing heart, just a sudden, absolute stillness in my mind. The wooden stool screeched against the hardwood floor of the hallway, a sharp, ugly sound that cut right through the melody of the string quartet playing softly in the dining hall. I didn't adjust my dress. I didn't check my hair. I simply walked toward those heavy oak doors and pushed them wide. The light in the dining room was blinding after the dimness of my exile. 46 heads turned in unison, a synchronized movement of shock and judgment. Silver forks stopped midway to open mouths. The laughter died so abruptly you could hear the logs crackling in the massive stone fireplace. Olivia stopped mid-sentence, her hand frozen over her glass of expensive champagne. My mother, Danielle, straightened her back, her face already twisting into an expression of practiced outrage. I didn't look at her. I didn't look at any of them. My eyes were fixed on the man at the head of the table. Stephen sat there, looking every bit the patriarch in his velvet blazer, his gold watch glinting under the crystal chandelier. He looked at me with that familiar emptiness, the look of a man who had already deleted my existence from the evening's ledger. I walked the length of the long table, the sound of my boots firm and rhythmic on the rug. I reached his side and stood there, a shadow against their festive glow. I didn't wait for him to speak. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the thick envelope with its heavy red wax seal, and placed it directly on his china plate, right on top of the prime rib he had barely touched. The silence was heavy enough to feel. It was the silence of a room full of people waiting for the help to realize they had made a mistake. But I wasn't the help. I was the auditor, and the audit was overdue. I looked him directly in the eye, watching the confusion in his pupils shift into a flicker of deep-seated fear. "Merry Christmas, Father," I said. My voice was clear, low, and perfectly steady. It didn't carry the weight of my 4 years of servitude. It carried the weight of the truth. I have waited exactly 6 months to deliver this. It is the truth that Great-Grandmother Eleanor spent her final days ensuring you would have to face. She didn't want you to have it while she was alive to see your cowardice. She wanted you to have it when I was strong enough to survive it. His hands began to tremble as his fingers brushed the jagged edges of the red wax. Danielle tried to stand, her chair scraping harshly. "Kelsey, take that trash off the table and get back to your seat," she hissed. I turned to her then, my gaze as cold as the Savannah winter. "I don't have a seat, Mother. Remember? You told me there was no room for disappointments. And you were right. There isn't. Not at this table, and not in this life." I turned back to Stephen, whose eyes were now glued to the envelope as if it were a bomb. "Open it, Stephen. Let's see what 46 members of this distinguished family have to say about the legacy you've built on a 34-year-old lie." The entire room held its breath. The air felt thin, the festive decorations suddenly looking like props in a play that had just been cancelled. I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, standing at the head of the table, watching the man I had called father begin to break the seal on his own destruction. Stephen's fingers fumbled with the red wax seal. The sound of the parchment snapping was the only thing audible in the massive room. He pulled out the first document, a crisp white sheet with a medical laboratory letterhead. I watched his eyes scan the rows of data, the genetic markers, and finally, the summary at the bottom. 0% probability of paternity. He did not scream. He did not drop the paper. He just looked at it, as if he were trying to find a typo in a contract that had already been signed. My mother, Danielle, leaned over to see, her face draining of colour until she matched the white linen of the tablecloth. I stood there with the clarity of a balance sheet. I felt no pity. 34 years of being treated like a mistake finally had an explanation. I was not his daughter. I was a living receipt for a transaction my mother had kept off the books. "It is 0%, Stephen," I said. My voice was clinical, lethal. "You suspected it since I was 5 years old, did you not? You saw the blood types did not match after that bike accident. But you chose to look away. You chose to keep the illusion and make me pay interest on your silence for nearly 3 decades. Stephen finally pulled out the second document. It was a handwritten letter in Great-Grandmother Eleanor's shaky but elegant script. This was the voice of the guardian. Eleanor had been the one person who truly loved me, yet she had carried this secret for 34 years. In the letter, she confessed her silent regret. She had known about my mother's affair. She had watched Danielle punish me, turning me into a ghost to hide her own guilt. Eleanor wrote about the agonizing weight of being the watchman. She stayed silent not because she agreed with the lie, but because she feared that if the truth came out while I was young, this family would have discarded me like trash. She was caught between a mother's love for her daughter and the justice she owed her great-granddaughter. She waited until she was gone to set the fuse. She gave her lawyer specific instructions. The envelope was not to be released until exactly 6 months after her passing. She wanted to give me time to grieve, but more importantly, she wanted me to have the time to establish my own life and find my own strength before I had to face the fallout. She did not want you to have this while she was alive to see your cowardice, Stephen, I continued. Eleanor's letter explained that my mother's cruelty was a defense mechanism. By making me a disappointment, Danielle convinced herself that her betrayal did not matter. I was the visible evidence of her sin, so she tried to make me invisible. And Stephen, you were the silent partner in that abuse. You sacrificed me to protect your comfort, because I was not truly yours. The air in the dining room felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. My relatives, the same 46 people who had just been laughing at my exile, were now staring at my parents as if they were strangers. The polished veneer of the Savannah elite was peeling away in layers. I did not feel a breakdown. I felt a sunrise, the kind of sunrise made of numbers, facts, and the quiet retribution of a girl who finally knew her own value. Danielle didn't just stand up. She exploded. The sound that came out of her wasn't a sob anymore. It was a screech of pure, unadulterated desperation. She lunged across the table, her manicured nails clawing for the DNA report and Great-Grandmother Eleanor's letter for any evidence that could erase the last 34 years of her carefully curated fiction. I didn't flinch. I simply stepped back, the documents held firmly in my hand, watching her stumble against the centerpiece she had spent 3 hours perfecting. "It is a forgery," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the Savannah mansion. "Kelsey, you are a monster! You are jealous!" "You have always been jealous of Olivia, of her success, of her life, and now you are trying to destroy this family with lies you bought from some back alley lab." Olivia joined in, her face twisted with a sneer that stripped away every ounce of her Boston polished charm. She stood next to my mother, a united front of entitled rage. "You are an outsider, Kelsey," she spat, the words dripping with the same poison I had tasted my entire life. "You always knew you didn't belong, and now you are acting like a greedy scavenger. You think this fake paper gives you a right to our name? To my trust fund of $1,500,000. You are pathetic. You are exactly the disappointment Mom said you were." I ignored them both. My focus remained on Stephen. He sat at the head of the table, but he had shrunk. He looked like a man watching a tidal wave from the shore, realizing too late that his feet were already underwater. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't calling me a liar, he was just shaking, his gold watch rattling against the edge of the china plate. His eyes darted toward the hallway, toward the study, toward anywhere but my face. And that is when I realized it. His 34 years of coldness weren't just about my mother's affair. They weren't just about his cowardice in looking away from the truth. There was a secret beneath the secret, a criminal undercurrent that I was only beginning to sense. He wasn't just a victim of Danielle's lie. He was a participant in something much darker. His panic was too deep for just a broken heart. It was the fear of a man who had built a kingdom on stolen land and just heard the sound of the foundation cracking. I looked around at the 46 relatives. They were the jury, and they were beginning to deliberate. The murmurs started a low, buzzing hum of voices. They were looking at the official laboratory seal. They were looking at Danielle's mascara-streaked face. They were realizing that the daughter, who had spent 4 years as a silent servant, was the only one telling the truth. The outrage wasn't just mine anymore. It was beginning to contaminate the entire room. Danielle realized she was losing the narrative. She turned her fury on Stephen, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, hysterical edge. "Tell her, Stephen! Tell her she is lying! Tell everyone this is all a mistake!" But Stephen remained silent. His silence was the final confirmation. It was the lethal silence of a man who knew the auditor had finally opened the most dangerous book of all. I reached back into the red wax envelope and pulled out the final sheet of paper, the one that Great-Grandmother Eleanor's attorney had verified with such precision. The room was still vibrating from my mother's screams, but I felt like I was standing in a vacuum of cold, hard logic. This wasn't about a broken heart or a 34-year-old affair anymore. This was a forensic accounting of my stolen life. I looked at Stephen, whose face was now a map of absolute terror. You didn't look away from the DNA test all those years because of love, Stephen, I said, my voice cutting through the festive air like a surgical blade. You looked away because my existence was the leverage you needed for a business transaction. I unfolded the document, a certified copy of a secret share transfer, and a series of letters between Stephen and a man named Julian, an architect who died 10 years ago. Julian was my biological father. The 46 relatives leaned in. The silence so heavy, it felt like the walls were closing in on us. Great-Grandmother Eleanor found the paper trail you thought was buried in the company's foundation, I continued, my gaze fixed on the man who had overdrafted my compassion for decades. When I was born, Julian didn't just leave me a name. He established an irrevocable trust with 20% of the family company shares. You didn't just find out about the affair. Stephen, you saw a payday. You appointed yourself as the trustee, then committed fiduciary fraud by draining the dividends into shell companies. You told me the trust was insolvent, while you used my inheritance to buy Danielle's silence and luxury bags. You didn't just steal my money. You stole my future to fund your lie. He had spent 34 years treating me like a worthless burden, because every time he saw my face, he was reminded of the criminal debt he owed me. He didn't hate me because I wasn't his daughter. He hated me because I was the victim of his largest fraud. You didn't sacrifice me for the family, Stephen. You liquidated me, I said, the words feeling like the final entry in a ledger of misery. You kept me small, kept me serving you, and made me drop out of school, so I would never have the resources or the confidence to look into the inheritance you stole. I looked at my mother and my sister. Olivia's $1,500,000 trust fund wasn't built on my parents' hard work. It was built on the interest of my stolen legacy. My mother wasn't just a participant in a lie. She was the silence that Stephen bought with my future. The Savannah mansion, with its pine-scented halls and crystal chandeliers, suddenly felt like a crime scene. The relatives began to pull back, their expressions shifting from judgment to a visceral disgust. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was a criminal discovery. You thought you were the owner of this legacy, Stephen, I whispered, leaning over the table as he collapsed back into his chair. But I've spent the last 6 months working with Eleanor's lawyer. This isn't revenge. It is an audit. And the findings are terminal. The heavy oak front door of the mansion creaked open, but it was not another late arrival for the dinner party. A man in a tailored charcoal suit and a woman carrying a leather portfolio stepped into the foyer. They were a senior attorney and a private process server, hired to deliver a message that couldn't wait for the holiday to end. I hadn't waited for a Christmas miracle. I had filed an emergency injunction and a temporary restraining order on December 23rd, just before the courts closed. They moved with a clinical efficiency, handing Stephen a thick stack of legal documents that effectively paralyzed his world. The Savannah Kingdom was officially under a forensic audit, with every personal and business asset frozen by court order as of 4 p.m. yesterday. The attorney looked at Stephen with a professional detachment that made the patriarch look small for the first time in 34 years. My mother, Danielle, tried to snatch the papers, but the process server gently but firmly blocked her path, handing her a separate subpoena for her role in the systematic financial exploitation. Stephen walked out onto the veranda, the documents clutched in his trembling hand, and he collapsed right there in the middle of the freezing Savannah rain. Olivia stood by the pile of luxury gifts, realizing that her $1,500,000 trust fund was now nothing more than a digital ghost in a frozen account. The 46 relatives watched, in a silence so absolute, it felt like the very air had turned to stone. This was not a family drama anymore. It was a full-scale liquidation of a lie. I didn't stay to watch them break. I turned and walked out of the foyer, leaving my tray of untouched gingerbread cookies on the hall table. I got into my car and drove away from the mansion, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just a dot of flickering Christmas lights against the dark. As I crossed the city limits, I pulled over and opened my phone. I scrolled through my notes to a file I had kept for 4 years, titled Things That Make Mother Happy. It was a list of my own sacrifices, a record of my attempts to buy love with my own erasure. I took a deep breath and hit delete. This was the true justice of the seed sower. I was done focusing on the punishment of the past. I was moving toward the architecture of my own future. I have already begun the paperwork to establish the Julian Architect Foundation, an endowment funded by the 20% of shares I am reclaiming to help talented students who are being held back by family expectations. For the first time in 34 years, I am not a ghost or a disappointment. I am Kelsey, and I am finally holding the pen to my own life. I am no longer a silent investor in their cruelty. I am the architect of my own peace. The best revenge is living a life so brilliant and full of purpose that the people who tried to dim you are forced to watch you shine from the shadows. If this journey toward truth and self-worth resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps ensure that voices which have been silenced for too long are finally heard. Thank you for being part of my reckoning.